So I think from now, okay, well, good morning, everyone, and a big welcome to everyone today, and welcome to Sheffield U3A to our guest, Mark Thomas. We've tackled a couple of fairly weighty subjects in recent months and during our talks program. You may remember some time ago, we had the chair of Sheffield's Race Equality Commission talking about her journey in education. Recently, we had the Friends of the Earth coordinator in Sheffield talking about responses to the climate crisis. And we also had a speaker from the Equality Trust recently talking about a parallel subject in a sense to what Mark is going to be addressing today, talking about inequalities. Now, it's important to note that U3A is, of course, non-party political, and we're not providing a platform for any political party, but we are going to be continuing to confront issues which all politicians express that they are concerned with. So the climate crisis most recently and most obviously. And in connection with today's topic, we know that the government talk a lot about levelling up. So all politicians recognise that there are difficulties and challenges with inequalities. So this brings me to today's speaker, and in Ecclesall Library, I picked up his book, 99% Mass Impoverishment and How We Can End It. So at our local library, I thought, oh, that looks an interesting book. I picked it up and was very impressed. Very clearly written, very well argued, very up to date, not too heavy on data, but very well evidenced. And I was particularly impressed by its author's impeccable business credentials. This struck me as very interesting that our guest is a former head of strategy at the PA Consulting Group, author of The Complete CEO, and a visiting professor at a leading business school in Madrid, the IE Business School. So that's impressive, I think, by anyone's standards. So I think without further ado, I'd like to just hand over to Mark and thank him very much for his time today. Over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along. Perhaps I should explain, because it is perhaps slightly strange how somebody who's had a career in business would end up writing a book like that. So perhaps I should explain how that came about. And I think, like most people, for most of my life, had a sense that progress was the natural state of affairs, and that each new generation would have, as a matter of course, better opportunities than its predecessors had. So when I was born, my parents assumed that about me and my brothers, that we would have better opportunities than they had had. And indeed, when my parents were born, my grandparents assumed that my parents would have better opportunities, and that was true. When my children were born, I sort of took this as being a law of nature, and I thought, well, my children will naturally have better opportunities than I have had. And gradually, I started to realize that that might not be true. And while I was still at PA, I began, actually for business reasons, I began looking at the issue of rising inequality in the US and the UK, and what that meant for the population as a whole. And the more I looked, the more concerned I became. So after a couple of years of doing my day job, but sort of investigating these things on the side, I thought, actually, no, this is really such a big issue that I should stop doing the day job and really research this properly and write the book that Philip mentioned, which I did, and that book was finally published in 2019. And I hoped that it would be well received. It was well received by the Financial Times because they picked it as one of their best economics books of 2019. But I thought it won't actually matter whether it's well received or not, because it will have zero impact if I write a book and just leave it at that. Books on their own very, very occasionally have an impact, but almost always have zero impact. And so I was afraid that that would be the case if I just wrote the book. So with a few friends, we set up the 99% organization also in 2019. So there were about 4 or 5 of us in September 2019. There are just about 1,600 members now, all of whom are volunteers and all of whom are engaged with trying to make sure that the UK doesn't drift into where, unfortunately, my conclusion was that if we just drifted on the track that we were on, we would not get to 2050 with our civilization intact. We wouldn't recognize the social contract in the UK. It would be a bit more like South Africa is, which is currently one of the world's most unequal societies, where you have a small number of people who are immensely wealthy, and they live a completely separate life, surrounded usually by tight security to protect themselves from the rest of the population, many of whom are in poverty or not far away from poverty. And actually, if you simply extrapolate the trends of where we have been going, you reach the unpalatable conclusion that might be where we would end up by the year 2050. So that was what got me started. And actually, over the last 2 years, I've become not more sanguine, but even more concerned about these issues. So what I was planning to do today was to take you through a few slides that will, I hope, explain to you why I'm concerned and also give you maybe some tiny hints about what I think we ought to be doing about it. But it's unfortunately mainly about the concerns. So apologies if it sounds slightly dismal. So the title that I've chosen is Malice in Plunderland, and with the subtitle, Why the Next Election is the Most Important of Our Lives. And I'm really going to talk about 3 things, and then leave hopefully plenty of time for question and answers. So the first thing is really just to show you a few statistics to show you how serious the situation that the UK is already in. So this is historic trends. The second thing I'll move on to is my thesis that we actually have a new kind of government now, which we haven't seen before, and that the next election may be our last chance to hold the government to account, which is why I believe it's such an important election. So let's start by just looking at some numbers. So this is what happened in the UK after the global financial crisis. So you can see there's a blue line, which is slightly higher, and the red line, which is slightly lower. The blue line is real GDP per capita. So that you can think of as being the size of the pie. If all the economic output were fairly shared, that's what each person would get. And that's indexed so that it's at 100 in the year 2010. So we can really see the trends since 2010. So that's the blue line. The red line is real median earnings, also indexed in the same way. So you can see that, roughly speaking, they were growing about the same rate up until about 2004, 2005. Then there was a bit of a divergence. And since 2010, what's opened up is a real gap where the economy is still growing, not so well, but it is still growing. From 2010 to 2018, but actually most people are poorer than they were then. And so this is out of date deliberately. I'll show you more up-to-date numbers, but this shows you the sort of thing that was making me very, very concerned when I started writing the book, that the pie was growing, but most people's slices were getting smaller. So that's median earnings, which you can see, that's a typical person's earnings. It's even worse if you were poor. So this is what happened to homelessness over that period, and over a slightly shorter period, you can also see what was happening to the number of food parcels that, I think this is the data from the Trussell Trust, that they were distributing, which roughly doubled over that 5-year period from 2013 to 2018, and also deaths from homelessness, people literally dying on the street. Those numbers were increasing. So it was, we had a period which was bad for the economy, but very bad for people, and particularly bad for poorer people. If we update the numbers a bit, so you can see on the horizontal axis here, we've got that same sort of measure, real per capita GDP growth, but this time it's going from 2010 all the way to 2021. And you can see that compared with most other countries, we did badly. Actually, we did better than some countries. Brazil did worse than us, Italy did worse than us, Greece did worse than us, but most of the other significant economies that you might want to compare us with, we did worse over that period since 2010. But if you look since 2016, which is the vertical axis, then basically we've been doing worse than everybody. So we've taken a bad performance and actually we're making it worse. We are actually, in terms of per capita GDP, we are getting, in real terms, the economy as a whole is getting poorer. And if the pie shrinks, then of course it's inevitable that many people's slices will have to shrink. And this is what you can see. So these are real median earnings of full-time workers. So real median earnings of all workers would be lower than this because obviously some are part-time. And you can see that we are nowhere near to getting back to the level that we were in 2007. And this is really unprecedented in living memory. There was a period in the from 1820 to about 1840 where the real wages didn't increase. But in living memory, there hasn't been a period of wage stagnation like this. This is a new phenomenon. So that is, from an economic point of view, the reason for the concern, and a lot of what got me started in my concerns in this area. The next bit is a little bit more qualitative, which is my suggestion that we're actually looking at a new kind of government that we haven't seen before. So we're used to this argument, big state versus little state, where typically you would think of the left-wing position being that the state can add value, and sometimes it can add more value than businesses, so you would expect the state to play a significant role in actually doing things. If you're a small state person, then you're very skeptical about that, and you say, well, no, without the discipline of competition, the state's prone to inefficiency, so really we should only get the state to do things where the market can't do them. And of course, you can be more extreme on either of those. You could be, you could say everything should be done by the state. Businesses are inherently predatory, and so we should get the state to do everything. We've never had a government in the UK that's taken that position. Or you could go far to the right, what I've called their Randian position, which is after Ayn Rand, who believed that the state was predatory and should be kept as small as possible and well away from businesses. And by as small as possible, what she really meant was that the only role of the state really was to preserve property rights. Everything else, healthcare, education, road building, everything else should be done by businesses. Again, we've never had in this country a government that's gone all that way, although I think Osborne and Cameron were somewhere between small state and Randian state. I think what we have now is an innovation, because we have a government which is actually ushering in total quite high tax rates. So some people have even argued that this government is sitting somewhere between big state and small state. And as Philip mentioned in his introduction, we keep hearing about levelling up. There's a suggestion that somehow the government that we have now is sitting in the middle. I don't think it is at all. I think the government we have now is an innovation which doesn't lie on this line at all. it's a different thing. It's a plunder state which is being built, where the idea is there's nothing wrong with tax as long as we control it. We don't charge the richest people the tax. We get the middle classes to pay the tax, and we then siphon it into the direction we want it to go, in which case having a big state is an enormous profit opportunity as long as you can control it. So a couple of recent examples that you may well be aware of. The personal protective equipment scandal. I don't know if everybody's come across this, but this is an understatement. Well over $1 billion, probably much more like 2 billion of taxpayers' money went to companies which had no particular qualifications in these areas, but were well connected with conservative ministers or members of the House of Lords, or they were major donors. So, for example, this top one, Ianda Capital, it's not its business is not providing personal protective equipment. It's actually a family office for a very wealthy couple of families, which means its job is to manage their investments and their tax planning so that they don't pay too much tax. And it was awarded £253 million of contracts for providing PPE. And when it provided that PPE, it turned out not to be usable by the NHS. So it's just sitting in a warehouse. So that's £250 million, which is by anybody's standards a lot of money, which was transferred to a company which was on the face of it not qualified, and which turned out to be useless at the end of the day. Investigations by the Good Law Project and others have discovered that the mechanism for that was that they circumvented all the normal procurement rules. They set up a VIP lane, which enabled ministers and members of the House of Lords to introduce favoured companies into the procurement process, and they didn't have to compete. So they were basically guaranteed these huge contracts. So that looks quite bad, because just on this graph alone, it's almost $1 billion of taxpayers' money, which has gone to these strange companies. But that pales into insignificance in comparison with test and trace, where the total budget allocated was 37 billion. And it hasn't been a very successful project. It's been immensely complex and immensely obscure. And £37 billion has been earmarked for it. I think the actual expenditure has been a bit less, but nevertheless, colossal amounts of money. And £37 billion is such a large amount of money that it's difficult to get your mind around what it is. What does that look like? If you add up the armed forces budgets, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, it's 39 billion. So over 2 years, the test and trace program had allocated an amount of money almost the same as the combined annual budget of all three armed forces, which between them have about 250,000 employees. They have expensive equipment that we see. If you're by the coast, you see frigates and destroyers and maybe even aircraft carriers. Wherever you are, you see fighters and cargo planes in the air. You drive past bases, you see lorries with people carrying equipment, etc. You see the evidence with your own eyes of what 39 million can buy. I just have seen so little evidence of what this 37 billion has bought. And the National Audit Office has done 2 very critical reports into this, which are well worth reading if you've got the time. It really is an extraordinary thing. It just looks as though huge amounts of public money have been transferred into favoured private hands. So if you start to think of it that way, if you start to think, well, all these big budgets, these departmental budgets, we could be looking to plunder them. Some of them you couldn't perhaps plunder, either because they're already plundered or they're not ripe for plundering, but some of them are clearly ripe, and the NHS is right up at the top there. Now, if you were looking to plunder the NHS, you wouldn't actually be able to get 140 billion of money into the private sector. But if you think about comparing our system with the US system, so here is our system, and indeed most other developed country systems for comparison. So the horizontal axis is a measure of efficiency. How many people, how much population can you serve for $10,000? So the US, you can see, is by far the least efficient of these systems. It only serves one person for $10,000. We serve nearly 2.5 people, so we're 2.5 times more efficient than the US system, and more efficient, in fact, than most of the systems. The other thing, though, that's important is effectiveness, and there isn't a perfect measure for that. But a crude proxy is life expectancy. And you can see that we're probably a bit more efficient than average. We're probably a bit less effective than average. And indeed, you know, the less we spend on the NHS, the less effective we become, although the more efficient we become. So when you look at this chart, you would think, well, there are some arguments for looking at what we could do that might be better. We might want to look at the Japanese system, or the Italian system, or the Spanish system, or even the Finnish or the New Zealand systems. We might think those would be interesting benchmarks. The one benchmark that you absolutely would not pick based on this chart is the United States, because it's really bad in terms of efficiency, and it's really a very ineffective system. But it is actually the world's best system in terms of generating profit. So if you were to rank some of these other systems and say, what would be the profit opportunity if you could make a transition to the US model, then for the UK, we would be one of the biggest prizes in the world at around about $28 million per annum, $28 billion, sorry, dollars per annum. So that is a very scary thought, given that, as you probably all know, there is a health and care bill going through Parliament as we speak, which gives ministers extraordinary powers, effectively to do what they like with the NHS, and in particular to do what they like with NHS procurement. So my thesis, to repeat it, is that we now have a new kind of government, which is actually different from anything we've seen before, which doesn't look at the UK as a country full of people, but looks at it as a gigantic profit opportunity for themselves and their donors and their social circle. The third thing that I wanted to say is that I think the next election may be our last chance to hold the government to account. I don't know how many people have heard what Ken Clarke said a couple of days ago about how we are dangerously close to becoming an elected dictatorship. I think he's absolutely right, because although the government hasn't been systematic about very many things, it has been very systematic in dismantling all of the safeguards that would normally enable our democracy to work. So the basic idea of a democracy is simple. Voters elect MPs, MPs select the Prime Minister, who in turn selects the government drafts laws on advice from the civil service, Parliament scrutinizes those laws, civil service enacts them. That creates outcomes which are in line with the promises, the contract that the government has made with the population, and that satisfies the voters' needs, and so it goes round. But of course, things don't always work, so you have checks and balances in there. So Parliament itself scrutinizing the laws is a check and a balance. Courts reviewing the legality of what government does is an important safeguard. The right of peaceful protest is an important safeguard, etc. And all of these are being whittled away. So we've got an elections bill going through, which is both threatening the independence of the Electoral Commission and proposing to introduce things like voter ID, which David Davies described as an illiberal solution to a non-existent problem. We've got a very, very serious attempt to install Paul Dacre, who was the former editor of the Daily Mail, as the chair of Ofcom, which is the regulator of the press. They had a selection panel. He was declared by the panel to be unsuitable, and instead of appointing their recommendation, Johnson scrapped the panel and has restarted the selection in his hope in order to install Paul Dacre. The Police and Courts Bill will make it illegal to do peaceful protests if there's any risk that you might make a noise that could irritate somebody. And the penalty for that is up to 10 years in prison. So things like protesting about corruption in government or sewage could actually become, well, you won't be allowed to protest on the streets if there's any risk you might make a noise. The courts, there's a bill to reduce the role of courts and reduce their ability to scrutinize government actions. We've seen Parliament being prorogued in order to prevent them scrutinizing laws, but also a lot of the new legislation has Henry VIII powers in it, which means that actually government, once the law is passed, ministers have the right to introduce new legislation without new regulations without needing to consult Parliament about it. There's been a purge of top civil servants. The Electoral Commission and other regulators are under threat. And so all in all, the whole cycle that's meant to operate democratically is gravely under threat. So I think Ken Clarke is absolutely right to be highlighting this risk. And that brings us to the next election, where the government has a majority of 80, and it's very difficult to lose a majority of 80. So even if you were to say, what if all the other progressive parties formed a coalition, there's still only about a 30% chance that they would get a large enough swing to get a majority. And the idea of, for example, a Labour Party having an outright win is not impossible, but these frequencies are based on every election since the First World War. So a swing of that size has only happened in about 10% of elections. So it's not impossible, but it's very, very unlikely that there would be an outright Labour victory. The most probable single outcome is that the Conservatives would be returned with a diminished majority. And that means that all these threats that I've just talked about are very, very real. So my conclusion is the next election is different because this government is different, and therefore we should treat it differently. The stakes really are very much higher. And the fact that people like Ken Clarke and John Major are calling out the risks show that that transcends party politics. But most people are not really aware of how serious the risk is. I think if they were fully aware, they wouldn't be voting. So there's a huge challenge to raise awareness, but also the government won't be unseated by a fragmented opposition. The only realistic chance is some kind of progressive alliance or mass tactical voting. So finally, thank you very much for listening to me. This is our website and that's the book. So do take a look afterwards, and hopefully we will have some new members. But now time for any questions and answers.